Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Korda. During the series, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. We're very happy to have with us today Father Anthony Schuerger, who is the pastor of St. Malachy Church in Cleveland. And Father Tony, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, it's an honor for me to be here, and I'm just delighted to be able to be part of the Diocese of Youngstown Jubilee celebration.
Well, it's wonderful because your presence on our show really helps us understand and celebrate our diocesan kind of communion as the mother diocese and the sister or the daughter diocese. So we're very happy to have your presence among us today. We know that you are an historian, and so you've got a wealth of knowledge that you'd like to share with us. Let's talk about those beginnings. Let's talk briefly, if you could share with us about the beginning of the Cleveland Diocese and then subsequently the creation of the Youngstown Diocese.
Well, I think the first and important thing to remember is that actually the story is a much bigger story and a much older story. It's part of the Catholic story that really begins, if we're talking about the presence of the church in Ohio, what is now Ohio, let's remember the French from Quebec, the explorers, the missionaries who first came to the Ohio territory. Just as if we're talking about the story of the church in the United States, we have to remember the Spanish in Florida, in the whole southern Southwest and California, and those missions. We tend to forget that. But even if we just talk about the United States, originally this was the Northwest Territory. And so this was the frontier. This was the West at the founding of the United States. And so really, this was part of the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the mother diocese for the whole United States. And then from then, in 1808, we had the Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky, one of the first four dioceses that was created from Baltimore. And that really was the Northwest Territory, including Tennessee, including all of Kentucky, including Missouri, and the Catholic presence there. And then in 1820, we have the Diocese of Cincinnati, which includes the whole state of Ohio, and then into Michigan. And then it becomes Ohio when Detroit gets founded. And then in 1847, the Diocese of Cleveland, which is the whole northern third of Ohio, from Indiana and Michigan to Pennsylvania. And for in that whole space, we're talking maybe 10 or 15,000 Catholics scattered around that entire territory. And so this really was the frontier. This really was mission territory. This really was the American West, although we never think about it that way now.
Sure.
And so as the diocese grew and flourished and developed, as the cities grew, as the communities grew, as parishes grew, then we had the church established and become stronger. And then in 1911, you have the Diocese of Toledo formed. And so really then the whole eastern part of the state of Ohio is the Diocese of Cleveland. And then in 1943, the Diocese of Youngstown is formed out of Cleveland. And so we really have three dioceses in northern Ohio that started with Cleveland, that started from Cincinnati, that started from Bardstown, that started from Baltimore. And that's part of what it means to be church, is to be connected with one another, although we respect local churches. And so it's proper to say, this is the Church of Youngstown, and it is a church in its own rights. Just as I'm from the Church of Cleveland, which is a church in its own right, and Toledo's a church in its own right. And so the Catholic identity is really both and.
Yes. It's interesting, as you were talking, the thing that immediately came to mind is that we are a relatively young church. You know, when we look at church as a whole, our roots obviously go way, way back. But in the United States, we are relatively young and new. Cleveland, in a few years, will be celebrating its 175th. And so, when we look at that in relationship to the bigger church or the larger Catholic Church. So when we talk about celebrations and we talk about anniversaries, should we put those in perspective in time or in place, or should we look at the bigger picture?
And my answer to that is yes, yes, and yes. And that's part of what it means to be Catholic, is that we are connected. And so, yes. And an old saying which I've always treasured is, you don't know who you are unless you know where you come from, unless you know what your story is. And one of the beautiful things about a 75th anniversary, 75th history, is that the beginnings are not all that far away. And so you have a lot of lived memory, people who can tell the story, who remember, and who can remember when this happened, who can remember the early days. And this is a precious time to remember and to tell those stories. But also at the same time to remember that this story that's so important to us and is part of our story is also part of a bigger story. And to remember that we are connected. And so the little story is part of a bigger story, which is part of the great story of the church, which is part of the great story of God's relationship with humanity, and in a sense, all of us being a pilgrim people who come from God and whose ultimate destiny is to be with God, not only with the people who are with us now, but with all of our brothers and sisters all the way back to the very beginning.
Yeah. We've only got about 2 minutes left of our first segment. I'd like you to talk very briefly about Bishop Schrems. Bishop Schrems was the Bishop of Cleveland when the Diocese of Youngstown was formed. Any interesting points or tidbits that you'd like to share about Bishop Schrems?
Well, the first thing to remember about Bishop Schrems is that he was the first bishop of the Diocese of Toledo. And so he first came to Ohio in Toledo and was the Bishop of Toledo, and helping then that church to be founded and to come. And one of the interesting pieces about that was that there was a dispute when the Diocese of Toledo was formed about the westernmost boundary of Toledo, which is the easternmost boundary of Cleveland. And I believe it was Sandusky County, and Bishop Schrems advocated for it should be a part of Toledo, and Toledo needs it. And while that was being resolved in Rome, he's named the Bishop of Cleveland, comes to Cleveland, and one of the first things that he has to do is sign off on Rome's decision that as he had advocated as Bishop of Toledo, that county belongs to Toledo. It is at the end of his time in Cleveland, in fact, Bishop Hoban is the coadjutor there, that the Diocese of Youngstown is created. And so, in a sense, Bishop Schrems is the central person in the creation of these two dioceses in the history.
Interesting fact. We're going to talk about some more wonderful facts in a moment. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Catholic Diocese of Youngstown was established on May 15, 1943. 2018 marks the 75th anniversary of the diocese. There are 6 counties which make up the Diocese of Youngstown: Ashtabula, Columbiana, Mahoney, Portage, Stark, and Trumbull. There are 5 other dioceses in the state of Ohio, Cincinnati being the oldest, Cleveland, Youngstown's mother diocese, Columbus, Steubenville, and Toledo. Youngstown is the smallest in terms of area, and the second smallest in terms of population. Yet it has the 3rd highest percentage of people identifying themselves as Catholics. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. It was in Dungannon, Ohio, in Columbiana County, that the first group of Catholics settled. St. Philip Neri, the first parish in all northern Ohio, was founded in 1817 under the title of St. Paul's Settlement. It was to visit this settlement that Father Edward Fenwick, the Apostle of Ohio, made his first trip to northern Ohio. 4 years later, Cincinnati was chosen as the see city in the state of Ohio, and Fenwick was selected as the first bishop. Today, St. Philip Neri remains the oldest parish in the Diocese of Youngstown, but it is also one of the smallest. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father Tony Schuerger from the Diocese of Cleveland. We ended up with very interesting information about Bishop Schrems before we took a break. I'd like you to talk now, if you could, about Bishop Hoban. We know that he was his successor. So talk about some of what you remember historically about Bishop Hoban.
Well, Bishop Hoban came, and he was at first the coadjutor for Bishop Schrems, and then became obviously the Bishop of Cleveland after Bishop Schrems died. And so he was in the Diocese of Cleveland in the immediate era after the war, of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And so there was a tremendous growth in the church, and Bishop Hoban was one of the real builders of the new parishes, of the new schools, of the new institutions in the time after the war. And so he was one of the great builders of that. One of the other things about Bishop Hoban was that he had a relationship with Archbishop Chickanyani,
yes.
Who was the delegate, the apostolic delegate to the United States. Mm-hmm. And so they had a relationship that was personal, and he also then was able to influence or at least introduce Archbishop Chickanyani to people who ultimately were named bishops. And so there was a perception during Bishop Hoban's time that he was also kind of a bishop maker during that era. And one of my pastors used to love to say the church is a network of relationships.
Exactly.
And it talks about how important the connection between people really is when understanding the story and understanding the what happened and the why it happened.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you talk about relationships, because when we look at the bigger picture, not only as Catholic Christians do we have a relationship with one another, but we also have a relationship with other Christians. Let's talk about that ecumenical spirit and attitude, which really is so much a part of our church since Vatican II. And why is it so important for us to have those relationships that are just beyond who we are as Catholics?
I think one of the fundamental things about that is to remember that Catholic really means universal, and that Christ's prayer in the Gospel of John is that they may all be one. And because we're so accustomed to the divisions within the household of faith, that our experience is that that's pretty normal. And we don't remember the scandal that it really is. Sure. And part of our history, unfortunately, tragically, sadly, is that here in the United States, we have experienced that kind of struggle and that kind of divisiveness. And so part of the reason for the Catholic schools, it was the need for parents to help raise their children in the faith, and their perception that the public schools really were Protestant and directed against the church, and so would undermine the faith of Catholic children. One of the beautiful things about the Second Vatican Council, and really some of the leadership of the American experience, was to help the Declaration of Religious Freedom. You know, Father John Courtney Murray really emphasized that and talked about how the Spirit leads people as the Spirit does and as God wills, and to recognize that healing of the divisions in the household of faith has to be a priority of the church, and that we can't just say that they may all be one. We have to work and we have to live that. And one of the great gifts in the 50 years since Vatican II has been the strengthening of relationships ecumenically among the different Christian households, and the way that we have found to cooperate and to work with one another and to build up the life of the church, to build up the life of society, to work with all people of goodwill, to advance, what the real plan and purpose of God is, not only for us as a church, but for all of humanity.
Father Tony, you brought some books with you. Not that you have to pick any of those up, but anything out of these particular books that are of historical import for us as we talk about anniversaries and we talk about relationships as dioceses?
Short answer to that is yes.
Okay.
I want to talk about a couple of things. One of them is, this is actually for the bicentennial of St. Philip Neri, which is the original parish from Dungannon. This is beautifully done, very carefully done, and it tells the story from a lot of different directions. And one of the beautiful things about this that I really want to encourage is parishes, when they have their anniversaries, to use that opportunity to tell their stories. Right. And that's a way of remembering who they are, where they came from, what their story really is, and the gifts and the blessings of their faith community for their own parish, but for the larger church. Right. The second thing I want to encourage and draw attention to is actually this book, which is the March of the Eucharist, which actually is from Bishop McFadden.
Yes.
And this was done within about 10 years of the foundation of the Diocese of Youngstown, and it has profiles of the parishes. And it seems to me it's a wonderful way of remembering our story, and especially from the perspective of the centrality of the Eucharist to our faith. The interesting thing about this book is that it then gets connected to actually something that happened during the Depression. Part of the New Deal was to try and find ways to involve workers in many different professions who were out of work. And so one of them was Works Project Administration, and they had a section for journalists and researchers, and they prepared a book about the Catholic parishes in northern Ohio. The Catholic Church in the Diocese of Cleveland. And this was published just a year or two before the Diocese of Youngstown was formed. And so these are historical sketches for all of the parishes in the Diocese of Youngstown, which at that point were part of Cleveland. And that becomes part of the roots of Bishop McFadden's story. And then to go all the way back, this book is volume 1. It's the history of Catholicity in northern Ohio. And this was work by Monsignor George Houck, who was one time the Chancellor of Cleveland. And so this would include what is now Toledo, Cleveland, and Youngstown, and profiles of the parishes, and historic pictures and the stories from early on. So wonderful source of where we came from, and a source that helps us remember how it was and how we got to where we are today.
Well, it's important for us to continue that story, and I think that's why we celebrate anniversaries, because we do continue that. And I think as a Catholic people, we owe it to our future members of the body of Christ to share that story, so that story continues on in them and through them to others. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we need to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they have so much wisdom to share.
The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father Anthony Schuerger from the Diocese of Cleveland. Father Tony, I think I'd like us to pick up where we stopped, and that is to talk a little bit more and briefly, though, about stories, about why it's important to continue to tell our story.
Stories are important not just in terms of who you are, but also because stories give meaning and help us to remember where we've come from. And there are lessons that remembering your stories and remembering where you come from have to help us not just remember and honor the past, but it helps us for today. Good example right now that is very much in the mind of people today is the whole question of immigration in this country. Well, the reality is every single human being in the Americas came from someplace else originally. Even the people we call American Indians are really the original inhabitants. They came from Asia. And the church in the United States is an immigrant church. And one of the phenomenon, the dynamics of our dioceses is we have people from many different countries and many different nations. And one of the challenges that the church has always faced, and those immigrants faced, is part of the debate today. What does it mean to be American? Well, how do you become American? How do you be recognized and accepted as American? How important is it for the church to help people to do that? And so that was part of the gift of the parishes, was to help these immigrants both celebrate and live their faith, to feel at home in a different land, in a different culture, in a different society, but also then to learn and to become Americanized and become Americans. It was part of the gift of the school system, it was part of the gift of the parishes. And at the same time, to be able to be part of a faith community with a language that they knew, with a culture that they knew, with devotions and prayers that they knew, and at the same time to be part of the larger church community. Remembering and knowing that history, I think, can be a help to us as we deal with the very real and very serious questions about immigration and welcoming people and how that process should unfold in the 21st century.
Let's talk a little bit about your particular parish, your pastor of St. Malachy's. Give us a little background of the parish and some of the wonderful ministries that occur there.
St. Malachy is originally an Irish parish, founded in 1865. Irish immigrants. First pastor, Father James Maloney, was there more than 30 years and built up the parish. And he himself was an immigrant from Ireland who came to Cleveland, ultimately entered the seminary, was ordained a priest. One of the interesting things about St. Malachy is that the dynamic of migration in the city of Cleveland is basically outward from the city center. And the mother parish of St. Malachy Church is St. Patrick's, which is actually a little bit further west and a little bit further south from where St. Malachy is from. And St. Malachy was a step, in a sense, back towards the center of the city, which is very unusual for the reason of the needs of the people that were there. And that sense of ministering to the needs of the people who were there really has been the thread throughout the whole history of St. Malachy. And being so near downtown, being around a commercial district, there has been a tremendous change in the neighborhood and in the people of that area over the years. And so the ministry of the church has grown and developed over the years. Education was incredibly important to Father Maloney. And so one of the first things they did was start a parochial school. And originally there was a boys' school, ultimately the Damaris brothers taught, and a girls' school, which the Ursuline sisters taught. Ultimately they merged into one school. But then in the early 60s, it was a time with the baby boom, because people were also beginning to leave the city. The actual school population of St. Malachy Church and St. Patrick Church and some of the other urban parish schools was declining. At the same time, there was an influx of newer people into the city, into the inner city, and where there was a crying need of education and there was real poverty. And so in the late 1960s, St. Malachy School and St. Patrick's School merged to form Urban Community School, which not only was a merger of parochial schools, but a broadening of the mission. And that's the name for it. So to serve the needs of the urban child, whether Catholic or non-Catholic. And then that continued. Ultimately, another parish, St. Wendelin, became a part of the urban community school community, and the schools initially were on the campuses of the parishes, and then a dozen years ago they built a new modern facility in the area. Another need that St. Malachy had was neighborhood outreach, and so just had programs for the children, had programs for the increasing poverty of the people in the area. And there was an opportunity for an adjacent building that was going to be up for sheriff's auction, and the church bid on that, acquired the property, and developed an outreach center that's now St. Malachy Center, which serves the needs of the neighborhood, with a particular mission of trying to help people to improve their situation in life. So serves poor people and homeless people, serves children, serves families, with the whole vision of helping them to accepting them where they are and helping them then to grow beyond that. There was another piece of property, there were some row houses that the church acquired, and one of the needs that the church recognized was a need of people who were in fragile health, who were dying, who didn't have anyone to care for them and didn't necessarily have a place to stay. We had tragic experience of people being found dead in an apartment all by themselves. People being found dead under a bridge, people living out of their car and dealing with terminal illness. And out of that came the recognition of a need of people need to have a home where they can be loved and where they can be cared for. So they created something called Malachy House. It's not a hospice, but it is a home for people who are at the end of their life's journey, who are under hospice care. And so the staff and the many volunteers there become the family, to love them, to care for them, to help them with that final journey. All of that was formed out of St. Malachy, and St. Malachy continues to support those ministries and to be involved in that, while also remaining a church community that continues to meet the needs of the people. Right now, Cleveland is experiencing a tremendous growth in residents in the downtown area, in the near west side and the near east side. And so St. Malachy is trying to then position ourselves to meet the new population of people who are moving in, to recognize and to respond to their pastoral needs, to try and be what we always have been, which is church for the people of our area.
Well, Father Tony, thank you so much for sharing your story, for being present, not only as we celebrate as the Diocese of Youngstown our 75 years, but also celebrating our mother diocese and your presence at St. Malachy's. And may God bless you in your ministry there, and may it continue to be fruitful and many, many prosperous years. Thank you.
Thank you, and God's blessing for the church in Youngstown and for your continued ministry as well.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.